Hey, good evening, everybody. I'm your host, Lindsay Smith. This is the Agronomists for this March 14th. And John didn't make it to the comments. And you know what? I have a sneaking suspicion there's going to be a lot of people that hop on 5 minutes to the end of this show and realize time changed. Anyway, so if you're like me and you sort of slept in this morning, welcome here. Also, it is St. Patty's Day on Thursday, and so I am wearing the only really green shirt I have, which is a Saskatchewan Rough Rider shirt. And so let's just pretend that we are anywhere near melting and football and all those sorts of great things. All right. As always, for this episode of The Agronomist, you can qualify for those CEU credits if that's something that you're into. Head on over to realagriculture.com/agronomist tomorrow, and you can sign up for your credits from this episode. Hey, we've also got some show sponsors. So big thanks to Real Ag Radio, to Mind Your Farm Business, and of course to Adama Canada, who's a sponsor of this show. Adama, while other sources of innovation run dry, Adama is here to deliver, leveraging the world's largest library of actives to provide innovative crop protection solutions to your greatest challenges. We're all in on you. Talk to your Adama sales rep today. All righty. Okay, so we are going to get into today's show. We're talking planting corn, probably some soybean stuff. And we're going to talk planter modifications, planting speed, and target populations. So get your questions, your comments in, get them in early, get them in often so we can tackle as many things as possible. All right. And without further ado, I shall bring in my guests. I've got Greg Stewart, agronomist with Maizex, and I've got Paul Hermans with Corteva. Welcome here, Greg and Paul.
Great to be here. Thanks.
All righty. So now to start off, well, Paul, you're close to my neck of the woods, but you're far enough away. I'm still going to ask, are you tapping maple trees where you are? And is anyone itching to get in the field?
I think, well, today, Lindsay, it was +4. The snow's starting to melt. Everyone's itching. That mood's out there. Hopefully in a couple months, we're done corn planting. And a few people are starting to tap trees. So that's a good sign.
All right. And Greg, where are you based?
I'm in Ingersoll, so just a little bit west of Woodstock, right on the 401.
Yes, yep. And what is it like there?
Center of the universe here. Yeah, it's good. It was warm. It was warm today. We've had decent amounts of snow, but nothing crazy, and it's going to melt pretty fast once we get some double-digit temperatures this week.
Now, so when would you say is now, of course, we do not farm by the calendar. Absolutely not. Never would. But when would you say around your area, where is sort of the average start date for corn planting, do you figure?
I think the average start date would be there'd be some keeners that would go before the 25th of April, but I think the earliest average start date would be the 25th of April.
Okay. Paul, how does that compare to where you are? You are in Eastern Ontario, even further east than me, everybody.
Just south of Ottawa here. So it's in our area, it's probably, I'm going to say 5 days later than Greg. And it depends on the size of the operation. So if you're a big operation, big acres, a lot of guys start going that 27th, 28th of April timeframe. Smaller guys, it's more of that May 5th to the 10th.
Okay. All right. I do find it amazing. I mean, of course, Ontario is a big place. Canada, of course, huge. But just even in Ontario, that difference between, Woodstock, Guelph area up to where we are, it really does sort of amaze me how big of a difference we can have in weather, in dates, in frost-free, all that sort of stuff. Now, we are going to dig into, of course, what's ahead for us for planting. But Paul, I wanted to quickly touch on last spring, because out in your area, you had a whole bunch of replants, did you not? How did that turn out?
Was more on the soybean end of things mainly. We had a bit of corn, but we had that frost. You're kind of testing my memory here.
I'm trying to remember which day it was. Yeah.
Towards the end of May, I think it was May 25th, 26th, but there's some parts of the area where we lost all of our beans. We probably replanted about 15% of the total acres that I cover. That's kind of unheard of. Normally we might get 1 or 2%. So quite a lot.
Now, was there any corn, because there was a lot of corn that was damaged as well, but was there any corn that actually had to be replanted, or it all made it through okay?
We had a small percent. I'm going to say less than 1%, and that was generally on the lighter soils that just couldn't keep that heat inside, and that's what happened in our area.
Okay. Now, Greg, I think we've even got, we might even have some panel or some slides of this for later, maybe, but how, I mean, we're talking about average into April. How cold tolerant or frost tolerant is corn?
Well, I guess the key advantage to corn is that you can kill it, and most frosts will just kill it above the ground. The growing point isn't above the ground, and so you often get a bit of a reprieve. Not that the corn is terribly frost tolerant from a temperature perspective. It's just that if you burn it off with an above ground frost, unless it's been really severe, or maybe it's the second time that it's happened in that month, the corn recovers from above ground frost. I would say 80-90% of the time.
All right. That's pretty good. Now we are having just a few technical difficulties with the comments. So Sean Haney, our fearless leader, is trying to figure that out. Jay is working on it. Producer Jay is working on it as well. Peter Johnson got to say hello, but Peter's special. So I don't know if it's working for everyone or just Peter. So Peter, you might have to ask all the questions tonight. Okay, so let's start. I'm going to start with population. Okay, so how do I, as either a farmer or as an agronomist working with farmers, how do I determine the best target population for corn by field? Greg, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, I guess it's interesting. Where do we start with that? I think I'd like to start in September, which when we do field tours in September, the number one thing that we notice is that ear count is not as robust or as consistent as we'd like. So I think it's really difficult to suggest to a grower whether he's doing things well or not so well unless he can tell me what his ear count is on the 1st of September. Then if he's out and has an ear count of, well, in our yield tour stuff, we get ear counts that are about 30,000, 30,500 ears per acre. Sometimes we stumble out of a cornfield and we tell the grower his ear count's 30,200, and he says, wow, I planted 34,000. What happened? So I think that's the number one thing that we need to get across is unless you've sort of tracked what's your seed drop, what's your plant stand in June, and then follow that up with what was your ear count in September, it's really difficult to tell growers whether they're on track or not from a seed drop population perspective. But I guess we would like to think that on most productive soils in Ontario, if your ear count is 30,000, 30,500, which has been the average for us in our yield tour, that you're probably giving up some yield because you don't have the ear count up closer to what we think would be more normal, 32,000, 32,500.
Okay.
And I don't know,
All right.
Paul, where you go on ear count and how to judge whether the guy's on track or the gal's on track from a seed drop perspective.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with Greg. It all comes down to ear count. I mean, people talk about population, but I want to have uniformity in my stand counts, and then a lot of factors come into play. I mean, it's going to be hybrid. What's your yield goal? What's the price of corn that you're buying your seed for? And then the big thing, market price too. I think really determines a lot of the population, and then the hybrid itself. But definitely ear count, and maybe Jay, if you could put up slide number 1. It's more about having that uniformity of stand, and I'm sure Greg would echo the same points. I would rather see on the top here, uniformity of emergence. We can get 100%. If I'm delayed the second column down at 95%, that's after a week and a half delay. And then we get variations of that in the field where we could have one plant that's 2 leaves ahead of the next one. Well, if it is the one that's two behind, that's just going to be a runt. It's not going to be the ear count. So that's what I'm striving for is, yes, we want to get out and get the population, but I need ear count at the end of the day.
And I think you notice that
Peter's
when you're out there, sorry.
No, go ahead, Greg. I'll get to Pete in a minute.
You notice that when you're out there in September, when you're doing a plant count in September, and you find these stalks that are registering as a plant, but they've got very slender stalks and they don't have an ear on them, so they're not giving you ear count, even though they might have given you plant count in June. And so then growers and agronomists need to sort out, okay, I had seed drop, I had plant count. What happened that I didn't get ear count? And to Paul's point, I'd say the vast majority of those stalks that don't deliver an ear is because of poor emergence timing, bad timing on the emergence, delayed, right?
Great point here, Greg. We kind of have this picture here that shows, so to the left-hand side, the first two cobs came up, after 1 day, the next two were 2 days, 3 days, and 4 days on. So it's that whole timing of emergence. And you look on the right-hand side, those cobs aren't as big, not as uniform, and that's going to cost us yield at the end of the day. So I know a lot of growers are anxious to get out and plant early, but I kind of look at with the size of equipment now, a lot of people can 4 or 5 days. To me, I'd rather make sure the soil's fit. And when we're talking fit, we're not smearing it in, good temperatures, not too wet, to get this uniformity ear count that both Greg and I think you need at the end of the day.
All right, I will get to Pete's question in a second, but this brings up my question, which if Horst Bonner were here, he might cheer, but maybe not. Does this mean then that you should plant soybeans before you plant corn? Potentially. Who wants to take a stab at that?
Paul.
I would say yes. And I think if you take a look at, again, so if we're looking at, corn planting at 34, 35,000 in that range, we kind of hit more of that range in Eastern Ontario. Well, if I lose 10% or 20% off of that because of poor ear count, that's going to cost me a lot. So for every 1,000 ears, kind of 7 to 10 bushels, right? If I lose 10 or 20% off of soybeans, it's not as bad if I got to start off with 160,000 population. And our soybean varieties today, in research compared to what we had 15 years ago, a lot more vibrant, can branch out and just have more production capability. So I think that's key, that we have to look at that. I've been telling growers, plant beans the same time as planting corn. And I think we're going to have more people plant beans first and then the corn later.
Okay, Greg, any thoughts?
I think the evidence is overwhelming that some early beans fit into that sort of early window better than trying to push corn into that early window. At some point in time, I'm going to stop planting beans and get to my corn because everything is lined up perfectly for corn in terms of the soil's fit. It's the 2nd of May. I'm gonna if I only have one option of planting soys or corn, I may plant some soys first, but I'm going to switch to corn and then finish off my beans once I get the corn done. But yeah, I think the evidence is overwhelming that the super early, ultra early window, beans fit in there better than corn does.
Mm-hmm. And to build on that, last year, Lindsay, we had some growers plant that April 27th to 29th. The conditions were pretty good, but then we ran into, cool rains, wet conditions, and we lost, in some cases, 3,000 to 4,000 population stand ear counts. Whereas I looked at growers that planted that, May that's the 7th to 10th, they were within 95% or better of what they planted. So it's kind of looking at that and how do you balance that. And I know a lot of customers are worried about what happens if it rains for 2 weeks and everything else. But it's again, I think we got to take a look at it with the size of equipment that we have and go from there. And I would argue planting depth is probably one of the biggest thing that kind of controls our ear count to a degree.
Okay, we'll get to that in a moment. I did want to send a shout out. May 2nd is a great time to plant corn. It happens to also be my birthday. It's a Monday this year, so the agronomist is going to be about manure on May 2nd. I'm just throwing that out there. I'm already planning ahead. That's how I like to celebrate my birthday, everybody. Okay, but Peter has a great question. And yes, the comments are working. Yay, John, you're there. Thank you. We missed you very much to welcome everybody to the show. So thank you, and we've got it working. So that's awesome. But Pete wants to know. So if we're trying to look at cob counts and we're looking at that, can we use a drone and count tassels to get an earlier indication? How accurate is that, or do we have to get into the field? Can we use a drone? Greg, your thoughts?
Is it the little bit of work I've done on that, I'm not confident that a tassel drone count will do the job. But Paul probably has more experience working with drones than I do.
Yeah, and it's we haven't got to the tassel pair yet. We've done more on the early stand counts, and to me, it doesn't matter if it's an early stand count or a tassel count. At the end of the day, I'm counting. Yes, it's a plant there, but I'm not measuring. Do I have a uniformity ear on in each tassel? Right? I could have a tassel. It's counting a tassel, but is that plant 4 feet tall or 10 feet tall? And what's the ear like? That's what I would look at. So it's good technology, but we're not quite there yet that it can do us a great ear count.
Okay. And Pete, of course, is enjoying the discussion on getting those beans in early, because then you can get the weed in on time or early. And that makes everybody happy, including the soil. And welcome here, Warren. Thank you for joining us and commenting. It definitely is a different show when there's nobody commenting.
If I'm planting soybeans really early, right, I plant the longest beans that my farm can possibly handle. Horst is showing us that that's the magic combination: early planted and longer season varieties. If you really want to capitalize on the early window, you got to push the maturity, and maybe you can push the maturity long enough that wheat isn't necessary.
Oh, that's a zinger. That's throwing down the gauntlet there. Okay. Alrighty. I'm writing that one down. Wheat is no longer necessary. Okay. Peter says to bite your tongue, Greg. All right. Okay. We're almost 20 minutes in, and to no one's surprise, I have not got to a clip yet. I'm going to go first, I think, to the Singulation clip with Matt Chappell. Does anybody else want to call him Chappelle? Matt Chappell. I'm sorry, Matt. I always want to call you Matt Chappell. It's Chappell. This is from 2020. Very quick clip here, but this is another visual of the importance of seed singulation, and that precision at the planting pass. Jay, if we can go to that clip now.
Matt, I want to talk about this corn crop this year. 2020 is an interesting year, a lot of variability in imbibitional chilling, some cold soils, but one thing you want to talk about is seed singulation, a big impact this year.
A huge impact, Bern. So there's no denying we've had our share of environmental factors that caused some poor emergence this year. But really one of the things we wanted to do is replicate and put some hard numbers to the value of singulation. We like to ground truth it and show what every hybrid's response really to good and bad singulation.
Now you have gone into the plot here and you've got adjacent rows, one that's got good singulation, one that's got poor singulation. Talk about the results.
Yeah, good singulation. I think this is pretty good corn here, Bern. I think you'd be pretty happy with this, over 200 bushel potential. And then when we look at poor singulation, we start putting those every little plant on top of each other, maybe having some gaps in there. We really induce that variability. We get more tip back, maybe we've even caused some competition between seeds and really induced a lot more variability and some real yield hurt on these specific years.
Yeah. So what do we got to do? I mean, we pay more attention to that planter, maybe our soil conditions. What do we need to take with us next spring to avoid something like that?
Yeah, I think soil conditions really got to be right. You can do everything you can to set up that planter and get it dialed in, get your meters working right, check those. But really, if you don't have ground speed right, if you have inconsistent moisture or inconsistent residue management, you can affect where those seeds are placed within the trench. And all of these things really can play a big impact on how how every plant emerges out of the ground, and does it get a fair chance at being that carbon copy down the road.
And that's such key, right? Because we don't know what the environment is going to be like next year, what the weather is going to be like. If you can sort of obviously get that singulation right, get your get your depths right, you can take that variable away, or actually at least have some control of it.
That's right. And we always say, well, if you got a hybrid that has some flex to it, well, if we're a couple inches outside of our spacing, well, that ear will compensate for it. Well, that's not actually the case. Yeah, if we add some kernel rows, it looks better, that ear flexed out, but it really doesn't compensate for that double or that little gap in the stand. That variability we know causes a lot of yield hurt. We can talk as much as 20% yield hit to poor singulation in the field. So really important to get singulation right from the planter in day one, and then we can really stay ahead of the environmental factors that really, they have their own set of quirks that can throw a wrench at us.
I feel like I have created a throwdown here. We've got Maizex and Corteva, and now we're using a Pride Seeds clip. It is just mayhem. Okay, so do we agree with
We're
Matt?
an open-minded group.
I told Sean we're an agnostic chat. All right, we're welcome to everyone. All right, but I like key point here. So is singulation key, and how do we get there? Greg, I'll start with you.
Yeah, my apologies to Matt and everyone else that agrees with Matt, but I've struggled with this one for a long time. And you can't ignore singulation because you can't get good population numbers if you don't have reasonable singulation. But in the big picture of things, singulation is not a big driver of yield. I mean, when I say singulation, we're talking, I think Matt was kind of going down the road that corn needs to be picket fence 6 5/8 inches between every plant. And that's nice to have. And there are some advantages to that, I think, even in terms of yield, but it is lower on the totem pole for me than what we talked about earlier, and that is getting the seeds all to come up in a tight window. I would be much happier to have poor spacing and they all come up within a 24-hour window, and I bet you don't give up much yield, even if your spacing is not great. But I've been yakking like that for about 20 years now, and I don't know whether that's where I'm still stuck.
I feel like this is so great. It's finally some controversy. All right, Paul, where do you stand? And then Greg, we'll come back to you now. We'll challenge some of that for sure. I love it.
I'm going to agree with Greg. I'm going to agree with Greg too. I mean, you look at studies that we had years ago, and there's a lot on singulation. And yes, Greg is right. It's important, but I'm going to take that even emergence over singulation any day. And I did some different planter speed trials where you'd get doubles and triples together, and quite frankly, it didn't affect yield that much more. It cost more for seed, but at the end of the day, it's uniformity, air count at the end in the fall, and that's going to trump it all. And it's if we don't have the planter set up right and everything else, I can see how that can really affect seeding depth, and I'm more worried about seeding depth than I am singulation.
Okay, so that's my next question. So Greg, if we're going to come to, I want them all to come up in 24 hours of each other, what's the secret recipe to get that to happen then?
Well, I think from a producer looking at his planter, he should focus on the elements of the planter that create the furrow, that lay the seed in the furrow into moisture, and that carefully close the soil around that seed. It's a travesty to spend money on singulation when you haven't spent money on trying to make sure that the placement of the seed in the trench is perfect. That's the target. And we don't have time to go over it, but I think the key elements are make a perfect trench, lay the seed into moisture, and do a really good job of closing that trench. And Paul and I have already bumped into this one a few times because I think we also agree on that, is if you're wondering whether you're quite deep enough to be solid into moisture, please stop the tractor, lower the planter down 1/4 inch, and then drive on. Because I think both Paul and Paul's Pioneers data, Paul's data, and our data would suggest, and we've repeated this a few times, but I think it's a really good thing to repeat. The risk of planting a bit too shallow is way bigger than the risk of planting a bit too deep. And so if you want every seed to come up within a 24, 48-hour window, you have to be into moisture. And even if that scares you that you got to plant 2.5 inches deep to get there, you got to do it.
Yeah, totally agree. And the biggest, about 24 to 48 hours. I have never had a call, or could probably count in one hand, planted too deep. But the calls planted too shallow on top of the ground and everything else, you get them every year and you just kind of shake your head. And we talked about that last year, but it's something that, growers want to get going in the spring. And as Greg says, get off, check every field, every different field, every different day, 2 or 3 times a day. That's really key. And I got a good slide there on slide number 3, Jay, maybe you can bring that up. And it's a study that Pioneer worked with Ohio State on planting depth, and we got tons, and I know Maizex does, and other seed companies as well. But if I kind of set it up, you've got planting depth on both charts. You got 2 years, 2011, 2012, and then we got a 1/2 inch, 1.5, and 3 inch. So the red bar charts on the left-hand side, that's our harvest stand. And you look at 2011, 2012, a big drop to 2012, but that's because it was a dry year. And then you look at on the blue side, on the right-hand side, that's the corresponding yield for those different planting depths. So I'm telling my growers, let's not go to 3 inches, but more that 2, 2.25, 2.5, depending on the time of the year. We want to have that seed. It wants consistency in moisture and temperature. And to me, if we're too shallow, that fluctuates up and down too much. And I think this data and lots of other data sets really help show that going forward.
Okay, so we have 2 questions related to this. Go ahead, Greg. Well, I get the questions ready.
I like the fact, Paul, that even though the 3 inch scares you, and it scares me too on various times, but your yields never faded. The blue bars for 3 inches are right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and
maybe not better, but not worse.
Not worse. Yeah.
And you get some naysayers say, well, if I go too deep, I'm going to worry about crusting. It's a big issue. And to me, I can work with that. I can run through with a rotary hoe. I can take all the weight off the plant and run across. I've got options to basically go and break that crust up if I get too deep. But if I'm too shallow, man, then I get into a nightmare, and it's going to be weeds all over the place, differences in emergence and everything else. So that's something I tell my growers that we're working with here in Eastern Ontario.
Okay, so 2 things that have come out of this. So John says, okay, so if we're thinking about rapid or at least consistent emergence over singulation, don't 2 plants that come up on top of each other in the same 12-hour window fight, as only one can win? So this is thinking about that neighbor, right? If it comes up too late, it's a weed kind of idea. If they're too close, do we have competition and one sort of takes over? Do either of you see that?
Well, I guess the quick answer would be 2 plants that come up too close to each other spatially, right? Say maybe not a double, but let's give them, they're 2 inches apart when they'd like to be 6 inches apart, right? The risk of losing yield, again, for those 2 plants that came up too close together but came up at the very same moment is really low.
Okay.
Now, if you have them too close together and one of them comes up delayed, well, then you're in trouble.
No one's used the word depends yet, right?
Yeah, now's your chance, Paul. Now's your chance.
And I think if you're on a sharp sand or a heavy clay and we're starting to run into moisture, water, limiting factors, well, then maybe I could see the 2 having problems. But overall, I would agree with Greg. It shouldn't be that much of an issue.
Okay.
Can I make just a quick comment on progressing through the planting season? So for those people who think deep is bad, so I'm suggesting this year, if you want to start at 1 3/4 inches on your April 26th planting, drive on. You probably got lots of moisture. Do a great job. But think about the idea that as every week goes by and things get warmer and drier, that you should be notching that down as you go through the planting season. Last year, we had an awesome planting season. Everything should have been perfect. Guys started on the 26th of April and left the planting depth the same until they finished on the 18th of May. And they needed to notch it down a bit as they move through the planting season. And when you don't, your perfect 2 inches on April 26th doesn't look so perfect on May the 18th when they're not quite getting into moisture.
I like it. Okay. Sort of like the rule of thumb of when you're, that terrible crop wheat, Greg, when you're planting it in the fall, the later it gets, the higher the seed count goes. So here we go. As you roll through corn planting, the later it gets, the deeper the planter goes. Okay, so speaking of wheat, Peter has a follow-up question. So he wants to know, so if we're talking about this even emergence, we want these plants to emerge at the same time or as close to as possible. That's going to maximize yields. Are there differences that can emerge sort of after? Can plants develop at different rates? So can we see variability happen even if they all emerge at the same time? What impact can happen sort of after the fact that we get some of these changes either in maturity or those sorts of things?
So, Peter,
ahead,
are you
Paul.
talking within the same field, or because obviously we see within differences in the field, we get differences in soil type, different zones within the field. And to me, as long as we have those zones that are all the same together, I'm not as worried. If I got, on the north part of the field is a sharp sand, and the south it's a loam, as long as those zones are all similar, I'm all right. If they're a couple days apart between the zones, that doesn't really bother me that much because it's a uniformity of a zone, and it should yield the same at the end of the day from a zone standpoint, if that makes sense, Lindsay.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just chime in there that I'll go away from the zone idea and talk about differences right in the row. And although I think emergence is critical, I agree that there are other factors that cause plants to drift apart. They all came up perfectly on the same day, and then when you come back to count them at the 6-leaf stage, they're all not a perfectly 6-leaf corn anymore. And so I think there are some forces that cause those plants that come up perfectly together to drift apart. And that would be sidewall compaction, or maybe fertilizer burn, or maybe the closure of the trench is just not as perfect as we'd like. So they survived the open trench a bit because it rained and they came up, but then that open trench or partly open trench haunts them in terms of early development. So yeah, I think there's some things that cause plants to drift apart, even if they do come up perfectly.
Add a layer to that. What about cold injury? What can we see in cold injury? Do we see plants that recover fully from it, or will it always knock a plant back?
I think it depends too when you talk about cold injury and stuff, and on different hybrid families have different genetics. And if you could put up slide number 2, just we have within our company, every company is going to have something similar, but stress emergence scores. And so if I'm going to be planting early into cool conditions, if you look at the chart in the middle here, what they did was at 0, 24, and 48 hours after planting, they put ice onto these different plots. And they had the top bar is a stress emergence score of a 7, so that's above average. The bottom one is a stress emergence score of 4, below average. And you look at the differences in germination just between those two different corn hybrids based on their family genetic differences is quite a big difference. So I think that's something, if I'm a customer out there, a grower looking at planting early, that's something that I'm going to take into account. The bars up on the top right hand side here, again, two different, the darker blue, the lighter green, difference in stress emergence, different locations. But as you go from the left to the right, the soil temperatures over 7 days get cooler and cooler. You can see they drop off dramatically. But again, it's that stress emergence score for lower hybrids really drop off. So that's something, if I'm planting early, we're encouraging our growers to take a look at that. Or if they have to go with the lower scores, go a couple thousand seeds per more acre just to offset that, to get those ear counts at the end of the day. But in general, We saw last year, some of the ones that we had a couple of plants that were good, a couple of plants beside that got frosted out. A lot of times those frosted ones didn't make really a good ear at the end of the day and cost us yield.
Okay, do you have some thoughts on that one?
Yeah, frost is nasty in the sense it creates variability, and it's really hard to account for. You get a little bit of residue beside a plant, and it gets nailed by frost much worse than a plant that's in bare, dark soil. So frost will impose some noise on the stand, even if it came up perfectly. Yep. And just to add into Paul's comments, I think we all have hybrids that are awesome hybrids that should not be removed from the lineup. They just shouldn't be planted on April 26th.
That is a wonderful, wonderful idea. Just quickly, producer Jay did mention we don't have our nameplate set for this episode, so I did want to remind everyone who is on today's episode. So it's Greg Stewart with Maizex and Paul Hermans with Corteva. I'm Lindsay Smith, your host. The show is brought to you by Adama Canada. I think that's everything. Oh, and if you still can't see the chat box, please just refresh the screen or your browser, and it should work. I'm frozen, so that's even better. Okay, there we go. So I think that's all the things we have to catch up on. Now, Warren, so Farmer Schneck has a good point here. They're calling for a cool, wet spring, hybrid selection based on cold sat germ. I don't know what cold sat germ is. Germ test will be critical again for the third year in a row. So further to that point, Paul, like you just showed, how are you advising growers to sort of make these? I mean, here we are, we're March 14th. So we only have a couple weeks really to swap anything out if we're going to. So how are you advising farmers who might be concerned about the cold, wet spring?
So I guess the biggest thing is again, take a look at your planter, how many rows you have, how long it takes you to plant that crop. If it takes you 15 days, well, then I think we're going to have to maybe look at planting as soon as we can when the conditions are fit. If you're 4 or 5 days and we got a cold front coming through and they're talking, you're going to go from 15 degrees to 5 or 6 degrees. Well, I would say let's first of all pull back. Let's not plant in those conditions. If we have to, let's plant during the heat of the day. I mean, the coolest part of the day is 6 o'clock in the morning. Maybe go at 10, 11. Let's pull out of the field at 4 or 5 at night. And it's that first half an hour of water that corn seed takes up and imbibes. That's the most critical. Let's make sure it's a warm drink of water. And then I would look going back to those, different stress emergence scores that we have. If you have to plant early and you're worried about it, pick a score that's above average versus one that's low.
Yeah, and just to go right to his point of what the germ tests are. Sure, you got to dig into those, have a look. But I think for the most part, we go back to that idea in that troublesome window where you're pushing things early. You got to be a little more careful in terms of what the genetics are or what your germ tests might be. To be just a little more careful in that window to pick your most robust seed lot and genetics, and then move on after you've moved out of that window.
And then I think too, I mean, we talked about planting depth, right? So I know sometimes people think go shallower earlier on, but then that means that shallower depth, it's going to fluctuate temperature up and down a lot more. If I go more to that 2 1/4, 2 1/2, while I got my blankets on top, that zone that's deeper, it's not going to change as much. It's going to be more consistent, not variable. And that's what, any seed likes is consistency, not that big swings and change in temperature and moisture.
Mm-hmm. John says, what exactly is a warm drink of water? We always focus on the cold drink of water. Who drinks warm water, John? That's gross. Okay, so now, yes, Peter, I see your Strobe question. I'll get to that in just a moment. Now, Jason Vogt says, I thought it was the first 24 hours of water inhibition that was critical. So for corn, what is that window? Maybe we can compare that to soys. What is it? Just that first imbibing of water has to be warm regardless of if it happens in the first 12 to 24. I mean, if it's really dry and you're waiting for a cold rain, is 3 days later too bad? What happens there? What does that window look like? And
I wish I had my chart up here, Lindsay, but it's that first half hour that that the seed takes up the most water. Again, if it's available in the soil, right? So you look at a corn seed, it needs 30% of its weight in moisture to germinate. Beans is 50, so there's a big difference there. But it's that first hour, the first drink, that's the most that it takes up, and then it drops off afterwards. So that's what I look at as being most critical. But we did see, though, 24 or 48 hours after, if we get a really cold front, snow, cool conditions, we're going to knock a couple thousand or more ears off at the end of the day, and we can't afford that. So it's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde game. I know people want to get going, but we got to plant in the right conditions and make sure we get the best stands at the end of the day.
So my only comment would be that cold is a problem, but the real problem is when you have cold temperatures, relatively cold soils, but then you get the snow or the precipitation in that 24, 48-hour window. We've come out of some really cold windows where it did not rain or snow, and we came through that pretty well, versus going into a cold front where you're planting into relatively cold soils, and then you get jabbed with a cold rain or snow. That's the critical combination. I'm willing to plant into cold soils. I'm just not willing to plant into cold soils when I know the forecast is going to get them with freezing rain at the 24-hour mark after I've pulled out of the field.
Yep. Okay. Now, what about seed treatment? So Peter asked, what about Strobe seed treatment to help with cold tolerance?
I would say seed treatment's really not much for cold tolerance, but it's more for funguses, insects and everything else that are going on. If you look at seed treatments, if we have cool conditions after planting and cooler conditions that take 2 or 3 weeks for that seed to get out of the ground and get going, well, guess what? That's a buffet for insects that have a lot more time to sit there and chew on it. I want to have that insecticide on that seed to make sure I get through that 2 or 3 weeks. If it's 4 or 5 days, really good warm weather, well, it's going to pop out of the ground, get going, not maybe as critical. But at the end of the day, for fungicides, insecticides, data definitely shows it's worth the value, and keep using it and drive on is what I say.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
I think Strobe's. I just would comment that Strobe's on the seed can impart a little bit of cold resistance. It's not easy to see. It's pretty subtle, but I think there is decent evidence that Strobe's in your seed treatment in a cold window can give you a little edge up.
All right. Now, Sean has a great question for Southern Alberta, because we're going to get some silage talk in here for the West, which is pretty great, I think. But I'll get to that in a second, because Canadian Cowman is sort of sticking to the planting early and cold conditions. So this is an interesting one. So thinking hats on, would selecting a lower corn heat unit variety to avoid planting early be a bigger yield hit than a longer unit variety or hybrid getting planted into the cold? It's like a riddle. So what are we balancing here in making this judgment call?
I guess if I'm going to go back and look at grain corn hybrids, right? So if you're looking at silage, half your yield comes from the grain. I still got to make grain at the end of the day. If I start looking at, let's say, a 90 to a 95-day hybrid, difference between those two, it could be 7-10 bushels. But if I start taking a look at uneven emergence, so for every 1,000 ears I lose, that could be 7 to 10 bushels. Well, pretty soon I can do that differences between a short and a long just with the poor emergence. I'm going to take emergence any day over playing around with relative maturities is how I would look at it.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in that, in some situations, you don't need to wait 3 weeks for the soil conditions to improve. In many situations, you just need to convince yourself not to plant Tuesday, but to plant Wednesday. So and that can make a big difference, or not Tuesday, but Thursday. So I don't think we need to switch maturities in order to improve the risks of early planting. I think we just have to be able to exercise the patience. Now, in some cases, exercising patience from Tuesday to Thursday may mean you then fall into 2 weeks of wet weather and you do have to switch. But generally speaking, I think the adjustments we need to make to plant under better conditions are measured in days, not in having to move to a completely shorter hybrid, shorter hybrid.
Okay. Now there's a great question, because I want to come back to this discussion of sidewall compaction and those sorts of things, which we've identified, of course, can really knock those plants back after they're out of the ground. But we'll get to Sean's question, of course. For Southern Alberta growers, what advice do you have when planting corn for silage on irrigation? First of all, we should all be so lucky to have irrigation on the prairies. But for Southern Alberta, this is a key part of agriculture there. So what is that package that makes for the most successful silage option? So basically silage under irrigation, it's like silage in Ontario because it never hurts for water. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I don't know that any of the rules change, to be honest with you. I think all the stuff we've chatted about so far tonight in terms of getting the corn out of the ground as uniformly as possible, I think those are still priority number one. That is priority number one for silage in Alberta or grain corn in Ontario. I don't know whether much changes. I suppose you have the luxury of being able, I don't know, dare you say, plant a bit shallower because you can look after the moisture deficit. That still sort of scares me. I'd sooner plant into moisture regardless of whether I've got irrigation or not, right?
Yeah, and I think in Ontario, I mean, we don't run into a moisture deficit really until, it could be middle of June, depending on temperature. So I'm trying to think through the irrigation standpoint. I mean, you don't need as much moisture early on with your silage corn plants, whatever it is. It's more that 2 weeks before and after tassel time. That's our critical periods. Try and manage it enough just to keep that crop moving along. But when you get to that 2 weeks before and after, that's where we really got to take a look at irrigation and what we can do to get yield at the end of the day.
Peter is yelling at me because it's nothing like Ontario, because under irrigation, you control the water. In Ontario, we don't control it. We just get what we get, and we might get upset. That's the lesson.
I don't have one customer irrigating, so this is a tough one.
Oh, so there, Sean throwing the curveballs tonight. All right, I'm pretty sure he's supposed to be off this evening, but of course he's going to join us for the Agronomists. It's a great show. Okay, I do want to, before we run out of time, I do want to talk a little bit about sidewall compaction, because of course it can be such a drag on yield, on all these sorts of things. So we did have one question about the use of wavy coulters. I just, Jay, I'm not sure if you can see it. I got to go back up and find it. But basically, what are some of our key, there we go. Does a wavy coulter create a compacted sidewall for the seed trench? So maybe let's unpack some of how we end up with sidewall compaction. So wavy coulter, yay, nay? Any thoughts?
I don't know whether it gives you the exact definition of sidewall compaction, but we know that wavy coulters in damp soils that are prone to sidewall compaction can cause all sorts of aggregate problems, false bottoms, a trench that's not easy to close. So there is some damage caused by a wavy coulter in a damp condition that if I was planting corn and I was in a damp, damp, let's call it marginal. You're going to go ahead and plant, but you know that it's marginal. The wavy coulters come up or off or out or somewhere. I'm not planting with a wavy coulter in front of my double disc opener if things are iffy. They're going up out of the way.
Okay. Yeah, and it's kind of getting down to a lot of times when we're going out looking at soil conditions, is it fit? We got to make sure that we're digging down where our tillage equipment's going to go to, and assessing and doing the ball test and making sure that we're not having too wet soil, because if we get especially with corn, if we smear it in and get those hatchet roots, we're basically done, and we're not getting that root development coming out. And all year we're going to need a timely rain every Friday night to keep that crop going, and a lot of times we don't. So make sure we got the right soil conditions, right fit to get even emergence at the end of the day.
See, this is where the irrigation will come in.
Well, I was just trying to go down the road, Paul, of a grower who isn't going to shove in the clutch. He's got to go, and he knows that it's a bit tacky. So what are your possibilities? Well, your possibilities in my mind are get rid of the wavy coulter at the front of the row unit, back off your down pressure so that you're as running as light as possible, and maybe having a crumbling closing wheel instead of a smooth closing wheel to try to crumble that trench close rather than to smear it closed. So yeah, I agree. We'd love to stop, right? When I tell farmers to stop planting corn, they usually stop listening to me. So the alternative is lose the coulter, back off the down pressure, and try to crumble the trench close, if you want to try to survive some damper conditions. And often the damper conditions are on 20% of the field, and so you go ahead and plant because 80% of the field is good. So those are just my comments about trying to survive.
I would add to that too is take some weight off the planter. And we've had some studies that with these big central fill planters, especially on wetter soil conditions, we actually lose more yield in the center than on the wings, not just more from compaction and everything else. So if we run in those conditions that Greg's talking about, we have to go, maybe you only put half the corn seed in, try and take some weight off that planter and have a better stand at the end of the day.
So, and I would say, for Ontario, and John's relating, of course, that the tap started sometime in September and didn't really turn off. And for some areas, it just kept raining, and giant rain events as well. So, I mean, if we're looking at a cool, wet start to this year, we're already on pretty wet soils, perhaps quite rutted soil. So all of this discussion may become quite timely if we're faced with, less than ideal, perhaps a little too wet. Let's say it's too wet, but it's quite warm. Is it the wet that's the problem, or is it the cold? Like, we've talked a bit about the injury, but like, is it that the double whammy, or if it's warm, can we get away with a little bit more? Also, Warren has a fun tip that tillage dries everything out, so just do more tillage. But he's being sarcastic, everyone. So just so you know. But yeah, so if it's warm and wet, can we get away with a little bit more?
I would say no. I mean, wet is wet, and it's the smearing, and it's the poor seed to soil contact, and just not getting that even emergence. That's what's going to cause it, the bigger issue at the end of the day.
Okay.
Yeah, wet is wet. The only thing that warm does is it gets you away from wet faster. If it's, it'll give you a chance to dry out a little bit, right?
I like it.
Yeah. Yep. And so I don't know. I mean, one of the problems, or one of the challenges, if you, and I hate to sort of jinx us here, thinking that we're creating a bad spring already, and we're not even past the middle of March yet. But one of the things that growers need to think about is a strategy. What's the full strategy look like on their farm for being able to plant as quickly and as timely and as efficiently as possible, right? Sometimes we have planting seasons that you can just go, and sometimes you have to hunt and peck and jab and dodge and weave, and so you've got to be ready for those little windows when you get them. And you can't be deciding whether your new tractor is talking to your new planter on the 26th of April if that happens to be the best day you're going to get for 2 weeks.
Okay, so, and that brings us to perhaps our last question, because we're rapidly running out of time and we still haven't talked about the clogs behind Paul. But here's a zinger, all right? Optimum planting speed. Does it vary by soil texture? Is it just about conditions? Is there an optimum speed?
Do you have a normal seed tube or a speed tube is what I would ask.
What's a speed tube? I legit don't know.
So, and again, we have these newer planters, right, with speed tubes that basically take the seed straight up and down. But some studies have shown if you have that faster equipment, and if the ground conditions are fit and we're not going over lots of rocks and everything else, well, then I can go 8-10 miles an hour. But if I don't have that equipment, and with the design of your seed tube being a curve, 4.5-5 miles an hour, I think that's where we got to stay.
Yeah, okay. I'll try to be quick on this one. If you have a planter that's not designed for high speed, whether it's the seed tube or other components that would move that planter into a high-speed world. If you've got a traditional planter and it's going to run between 4 and, I don't know, 7 miles an hour, to me, whether you can go 4 or whether you can go 7 is how much the row unit is bouncing. If the row unit is not bouncing because you've done a beautiful job of preparing the field and there's a big dark cloud coming from the west, I'm planting at 7 miles an hour, right? If I've got a field to the row unit, I can look back and everything's going like this, I'm planting at 4 miles an hour, whether the dark cloud is on top of me or not.
Put your coffee on the planter unit, and if your coffee's still full at the end, you're okay.
You're doing fine. Yeah, but no, then you need 2 coffees, because what am I drinking in the cab? Okay, so bring 2. All right, Peter brings up a question about variable rate seeding, which of course we could probably do a whole show on, and maybe we will, but perhaps just quickly looking at population by zone, where are we at with variable rate seeding for corn? Are we feeling, what's our general feeling? Are we feeling we're getting there on this? Is this still, are we banging our head against a wall? Are we seeing some wins on this one? Where are we at?
I think we're seeing some wins, and it comes down to we've got the equipment now that we can do it out in the field. We got the equipment here, the computer in front of me that I can put data in. We've got all the research data, and for every 10 bushel difference in increments, I can give you a different population. It's something I think we've got to look at. I've seen locally here. We did some trials 5-6 years ago. We were, picking up 5 to 10 bushels, and we started adding that up over acres. That adds up at the end of the day. So I'm all for variable rate seeding, same, especially for soybeans too.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the numbers have been hard to work with. It's been tough to find big wins. I mean, if you have a droughty area in a field and you want to drop to 28,000, well, you can win in the sense that you're going to save yourself, a bunch of money on seed. Does it change the yield significantly if I drop on that droughty spot? If I drop to 28,000 instead of 33, I think it changes it a little bit in a positive sense. But if I add a little bit of savings from seed and I add a little bit of savings from yield improvement, I get a modest win. But I don't see us making $100 an acre just because we're variable rate seeding on tough spots in the field. I see some marginal wins, but not huge.
Well, and so realistically, I mean, hey, if you've got the equipment or somebody who wants to run it and you're interested in that, then great. But there's probably a lot we can do to improve every pass with even just your basic planter, and away we go. And I certainly know a couple farmers that have been trying that, of trying to do the best job they can with what they've got and work on, where they're at, as opposed to necessarily putting a lot of money into tech or these sorts of things. Maybe down the road, but for now they're focusing on what they can control. Yes. All right. Okay. So I think, look at that, we are to time, which is pretty amazing. So one question, Paul, where did you get your clogs from? Are they actually wood? Do you wear them?
They're actually from my dad. So he's wore them for years, and I inherited them, and I'm going to wear them. I used to wear them when I was a kid. They're very comfortable. Yes. They're better than Crocs.
Okay, so I've been told this, and I mean, I suppose I can believe they're better than Crocs. I just don't know how wooden shoes could be comfortable.
Except on ice.
Right, okay. Yeah, that's fair. All right. Oh goodness. Alrighty. Okay. Well, Greg, I want to end on a happy note, because you're right. We are many weeks away from spring, and let's not call this one a bad one when we're not even there. My fields are still covered in snow, so there is plenty of time to have a great planting season just around the corner. So we'll see. Maybe we'll check back in end of May, beginning of June, and see what we're up to. See if we're scrambling to get it all in or not. But Greg Stewart and Paul Hermans, thank you both so much for sharing your time and your insight tonight. Really enjoyed it. Thank you to everyone who joined us in the comments. You make the show worthwhile and so much fun. Head on over tomorrow to realagriculture.com/agronomists, and you can sign up for your CU credits. And we'll be back next Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern. And for all of you who are an hour late, let's hope you're on time next week. All right. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
See you.